Shall we pray? Our Father, let thy Spirit be with us this beautiful Saturday night. In Jesus' name, amen. Norman's account of the man in the little topper that got on that bus, after all, reminded me of a more typical American story that might balance it a little. Two men came to a hotel after midnight, and they were a little bit and they went up to the night clerk and said, "We want to remain." And he said, "You can remain, you can sit down there." And after sitting there for a long time, finally they went up and said, "You didn't understand us right. We said we wanted to remain." "Oh, I see what you mean. You mean you want to retire. That's what we were trying to tell you all this time." "Well, what kind of a room do you want?" One of them said, "We want 2 rooms with a bed in it." The other one said, "We want 2 beds with a room in it." And the night clerk said, "I know what you mean. You want a room with 2 beds in it." "Well, that's what we've been trying to tell you all this time." And he took them up to the room, and they got ready for bed and turned out the light, and they both got on the same bed. And one said, "Pat, there's a man in bed with me." The other said, "Mike, there's a man in bed with me. What shall I do?" "Kick him out." After some kicking, pretty soon Pat said, "Mike, I kicked my man out." Pat said, "Mike, my man kicked me out. What shall I do?" "Get in bed with me." One day, a minister announced, "I'm going to preach the greatest sermon next Sunday ever preached." And all of his friends went, and all of his enemies went to see how much egotism he must have. And when they arrived, he recited the Sermon on the Mount, which takes about a half an hour to recite. And when he finished, he said, "If any of you know of a greater sermon than this, I'd be very glad to have you tell me." I agree with him that is the greatest sermon ever preached. If you understand that, you really understand all that you need to know about life, the conduct of life, your relations with your fellow man, your relations with God. It's divided into 3 sections. The first section tells us all we need to know about our relations with man. The next section tells us all we need to know about our relations with God. And the third weaves together those 2 relationships and forms a most perfect pattern for a prayer. Can those in the back of the room hear all right? Now, how should we classify mankind that we must adjust ourselves to? As we went around the world, we found that there is very little difference, basically, in the races. Especially when we reached India, dark-skinned, but they were the same breed as ourselves. I said, I feel like I've come back home. Here's where my ancestors started, up here in the Himalayas. And when we came down to the lowlands, one half of the gang stopped and settled down under the hot sun and began to meditate. The rest of us went on west, and under the Baltic shadows and clouds, we got bleached out, and we kept going on, and now here we are. Even the language, basic language, is the same. God, Mother, Father, Star, those basic things were the words about the same in both languages. But the words for water Sea, ocean, are entirely different, showing that we separated before we reached the water. And there we are. There's not such difference between races. Nehru is very much like brilliant, like Stevenson, who gave such brilliant addresses, who ran against Eisenhower. I would say that we have very many prototypes like Gandhi over here, unless it should be Rufus Moseley. But at any rate, we found that they were the same temperaments, types, and there's not the nationalities. It's no difference. We can't divide them in nationalities, excepting by language barriers. But one woman tried to divide folks into two classes. She was preparing a party, and she wanted to get a proper mixture of types and temperaments, and she found that she could divide them into two classes, chemically speaking, the bromides and the sulfites. The bromides, you knew exactly how they would act. They'd always say, "I'm glad to meet you," and when they'd leave, they've had a very nice time. The sulfites, you never know what they were going to say. A bromide would say to his bride, "Honey, pass me some more of those hot biscuits." The sulfite would say, "Hey, you little battle axe, hand me some more of those burnt offerings." The sulfite is more interesting, exciting, but the bromide is a little more comfortable to live with on the long run. Young men rather enjoy courting the sulfites, but they're a little safer to marry the bromides. There are some folks here, usually these folks have come out of Alcoholics Anonymous. They're the ones that are sulfites. You never can tell what they're going to say next. They're the humorous ones. Will Rogers wasn't a bromide, he was a sulfite, and so was Mark Twain. Well, there it is, but that doesn't get you anywhere. Jesus said the way to divide them up as far as your own practical relationship is, comes down to this. Some you're naturally drawn to, some you're not naturally drawn to, and some you just do business with, and neither nor, and there you are. How should you treat? And he gave down a code for treating all of them. Now there's some that I'm not naturally drawn to. What I mean, materialists that just don't want to talk about anything spiritual. But I want to say, down at heart, they're just as fine, human, but it is my business to go with them. Roger Babson, a spiritual man, offered me a position. I don't know, be mingling more with the wealthy folks. I won't know whether it's $50,000. I never asked what the salary was, but it would take me out of this whole field of meeting with people like you. I knew where my place lay, and if they'd make me a general-in-chief of the American armies, dealing with just military-minded folks, they're fine men. But the point is, my place in life is to give time to those that I'm drawn to, and he says then, those that you're drawn to, love them. If you're children of your own children, you should love them. Your wife, you should love her. You should love those that you're thrown with. In your college, you're at Harvard and you're going to play football against Yale. Well, it's all right. Yale, rah, 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 Harvard. That isn't any crime. Love, be loyal to your teams. That's where you get your training. But he said, there's just this question. Don't let that love go overboard into infatuation or lust or possessiveness. I want to say that one of the biggest problems I've had to face in counseling people is where men or women come to me and say that we'd be very happy if it wasn't for my mother-in-law or my be their own mother. I'm the only son. My mother just has such possessiveness of me. She says, now I brought you up. You really belong to me. And you don't have any business putting your wife first. You should always get me first. That possessiveness can wreck families, wreck homes. It's one of the most, and yet that's a wonderful love that mother has. And there's an affinity there between that she has for the son, but that's wrong. There's no religious leader, but at the times that someone gets an infatuation for him. Well, that's all right, but he knows how to give that on to God. Then they would raise the question, but supposing someone gets an infatuation, you must have an infatuation for others, but supposing someone gets an infatuation for you and wants you to go a mile out of your way with them. All right, said Jesus, go 2 miles and they'll get bored in the second mile and they'll get cured. Every method Jesus used was not the harsh method, but the kindly method, but directing them and educating it up. In that second mile, you can talk with Jesus and you can get them turn that infatuation on to the source of things. Then, supposing those that you're not drawn to, then does that mean you should hate them? And I have a perfect right to go around with well, now, for instance, we're divided into races, that's in colors, and I personally think that intermarriage between the races is a mistake, and on all sides. That means I should hate the Negro, and even eat at the table with him. No, it means that when the Yale men come up and you're going to have a Harvard-Yale game, that you should go out and catch some of those Yale men and beat them up. No, you should respect them. Don't say thou fool or have murder thoughts. Treat them with just as much respect. And if they would happen to be at Harvard or it's just a matter of the economy of the universe, divine economy of the universe, that we are divided somewhat into groups. Supposing all the students at Macalester just adored Professor Clark's work, and all wanted to major in English, and all wanted to have personal conferences and write their theses and compositions for me, I'd be in my grave long ago. But a lot of them prefer biology. Then should I get bitter and provoked at those folks because they like Professor Walter's work better than mine? No, I should be very thankful. It's a part of the divine economy. Don't say thou fool because you don't know how good this teacher I am. All that is just a normal adjustment, but just to give your time to the people that you're thrown with. Here's a minister, the Baptist church. He shouldn't be rushing over there and necessarily visiting all the sick of the Methodist church, and he'll be winning them over perhaps to his church. Let them. You have a perfect right to concentrate on those that God has given you. And so I'm not rushing to the ashrams and rushing in this. Let me give a speech and show my love for you folks. Why did it sound like I was dressed around to win them over to come to Camps Farthest Out? I should give my attention to make this as good as possible and have great reverence for the wonderful work of Stanley Jones and his work. There's a rivalry, between cities. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Some of the little villages around there said. And over Minneapolis, they think, they don't like St. Paul. And in St. Paul, there's a rivalry against Minneapolis. Once they tried to combine the two cities, and it was working out very nicely until they tried to decide on a name. And then one of the Minneapolis men suggested Minnehaha, famous Minnehaha Springs. St. Paul man asked, what does that stand for? Why, Minnie for Minneapolis and Ha-Ha for St. Paul. And that fell through. I heard my little boy debating with a Minneapolis boy about the merits of the cities, and finally I heard my son say, well, there's one good thing that Minneapolis has that St. Paul doesn't have. And I was curious to find out, and then he said, a good city next to it. But now I like these arguments back and forth. But supposing You treat them with respect, but they don't treat you. Here when I was at Harvard, when we played Yale, there's signs all over the Harvard campus, to hell with Yale. Professor of English in Harvard was going to a game, old Dr. Briggs, with Edward Everett Hale one day, and his wife asked him where he was going. He said, to Yale with Hale. But supposing a Yale man sees those signs and say, are you a Harvard man? And I say, yes. I am proud to be a Harvard man. And then what does he do? He slaps me on the cheek. And then I turn my other cheek, and then what did he do? Oh, I beg your pardon. Of course, that's just in good sport. I'm sorry I lost my temper. Please forgive me. Jesus always counseled the kindly way of solving those problems. And then this matter of what should you do with the folks you do business with. He lays down a code there. Trust them all the way. Don't even take a note. Just let their word be as good as their bond. Now, in this day of income taxes and all things like that, we have to, and we're responsible for a company we're dealing with. We must be honest with other folks' money, the company's money. We just can't do things all that way. You can personally. But at any rate, that's what he said, trust them. And then this question was raised. What if they just steal the shirt off your back? In the Moffat translation, that's what it is. In the other translation, it's if he takes your coat, then give him your overcoat also. And then he'll apologize and he'll give it back, maybe with interest. Well, supposing he doesn't. If he doesn't, if you trust him, you're trusting the infinite, and if he takes it, the Lord will send it back in some other way. I have used that method. I have... So many people have come to me in need, one way or another, wanted to borrow, and I knew that they couldn't always pay it back, but I would trust them and would require notes. And I won't say it's up in the hundreds, but I'll say up in the thousands that I have been out. You play me, they may say they play you for sucker. Well, it's a bad thing to feed their weakness. I have thought that over, and I don't, but I'm a little bit sound on that. But if I know no one else could lend it, the banks can't, that's a foolish thing, and I'll lend it and have to keep that person going, feed their children and all, and I don't get it back. I have found in doing in that spirit, it always comes back in some other way. Always. I think my prosperity has grown because of my almost carelessness in following that law. There's a young chap came to McAllister, a very cynical type, and he followed me around and listened to everything I said, and yet he was such a cynical type, very he's of the intelligentsia, aristocracy type. And one day he said, "You're the only prophet that's gotten into the Atlantic Monthly." Then I saw he was just drawn by my ambition. He was just worshiping my intellect, as it were. Well, one day he came into my office and said, "Your philosophy didn't work, Prof. I tried it out last night, and it certainly went flop. A highwayman held me up on the campus as I was coming to the play practice late last night and took my watch. He said I was coming down Snelling Avenue, and I thought I heard footsteps started dogging me, and when I passed Grand Avenue, I wondered if I should go down to the drugstore the next block and kind of shake off the feeling, but I thought I ought to be trusting people and trust the Lord, and I walked across the campus, and under those heavy trees, a gun was stuck in my ribs, and put 'em up, buddy. Said, your philosophy didn't work. Well, my philosophy didn't work. I knew Jesus' philosophy worked. I didn't have much to say, but the next week he came in, closed the door, and he sat down and said, "Prof, I think I should tell you that my father found that watch in the back seat of a taxi 3 years ago, and he refused to announce it in the lost column like Mother wanted him to, and he gave it to me." Folks, if any of you are carrying stolen watches, you be awful careful going across campus. Is it nice? if you've got stocks and bonds that you got illegally or by some scheme or from your brothers or sisters when the will was signed and you got what didn't belong to you, keep it locked up in the safe. Even then, there's likely to be a 1929 crash and take it from you. But that which is really your own, you can trust in the hands of God. I don't even lock my front door. If a highwayman should wake me up at night and say, I'm come to find your money, I say, just wait a minute, turn on the light, and I'll get up and look with you, and between the two of us, we may find a little. There's a man down in Birmingham, Alabama, the saint of Alabama, Birmingham, they called him, Brother Brian. If you'd ask him a question, if you'd call him up or call on him, the first thing he'd say, let us pray. He was a highwayman, held him up and took his watch and his wallet. And he said, you forgot something, friend. And the highwayman said, what? He said, let us pray. And when he finished praying, the highwayman returned his watch and his wallet. But he's a young man. He proposed to a young lady, and she declined. He said, let us pray. And when he finished praying, she accepted him. Well, trust. Then he ended this chapter 5 of Matthew with a marvelous psalm prayer on love. And it's an all-out love. So sometimes we just read this and say those are interesting words. Love those who persecute you and despitefully use you and all that. But it is this. It's love. You can just sum it up in mathematics. Not 98% or 99%, but 100%. Love your enemies. Why, even the Gentiles and the pagans, they love their friends and their neighbors. But if you love your enemies, then you shall be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. He lets the rain fall upon the good and the bad, and the sun rises on the just and the unjust. That's going all the way out. And would it be safe to start out just that way, amiably loving everybody? You know, if everyone, all the churches of America, all the Christians of America, turned and sent out love to the communists, to China and to Russia, we would disarm them. There's everything. It would just everything work out. By the way, I don't know if people realize the power of love. Love is such a tremendous instrument. It is. It's nothing sissy about that. Vengeance is mine. I will recompense, saith the Lord. Do good to those who persecute you. If a person sends out an evil thought toward you, and he's angry at you, and you send there angry at him, his anger and yours makes a perfect bridge. They unite perfectly. Then he has a mean thought. He wishes you would go out and fall down, bump your nose, and his thought walks along that bridge. He finds that you've fixed another little bridge, and it reaches you easily. You go out and you bump your nose. On the other hand, when he sends out a hate, and he sends out some bad thoughts, you send out love. It forms a perfect wall against hate. And his thoughts boomerang back. They don't hit him the first time, another second, the third time. If he keeps it up, he falls down and bumps his nose. Everything he sends out and wishes. Now, I've been over in Hawaii, and I know about those kahunas. There's the black kahunas and the white kahunas. That's just the label they give them. You go to a black kahuna and say, I want this man to die. All right, you give me $100, and 2 months from now, on Friday the 13th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he'll die. And about 9 o'clock in the morning, he complains of pain in his legs, and he has to go to bed. He can't stand up. The pain, the coldness keeps going higher and higher. But a man I know is conducting a crew of Hawaiians, doing some work group, and one of these Hawaiians began to feel this creeping sickness. And he had to go to bed. And this man I know went in and said, the boss, the manager said, is there anyone has anything evil intent against you? Have you got any enemies? No. He couldn't think of any. But later, about midday, he called him in and said, I remember there's a kahuna in my village, said if you ever work for a white man, a curse is going to be on you. Well, then let's send love toward that kahuna. And they sent a wall of love there. And gradually that pain wall went down, and he was all right. They were wandering around, they were surveying, doing on this journey all around the island, and finally they were coming to a village. It happened to be the village where this young man had lived. And when they came in sight, some of the natives saw them and got a sight of him, and they spread the word, and then they saw everyone in the village flying in fright into the forest. And when they came to the village, there it was vacant. And they finally caught one of the chaps behind a tree and asked him what it was all about. And they said that the kahuna in that village suddenly began to scream one night, and the people came to his aid, and he said, someone's turning the curse against me. And he died that very night. And he told them who it was, and said, when we saw you coming with this crowd of this bunch of men, we thought you were coming to bring enmity upon us of some kind. I know that so clearly. I wrote it down you'll find it written out in my story of my life, A Man's Reach. I put this in the magazine, that the reason why in the summer of 1942, I said Hitler, Jung says his mastery over the other leaders of Europe is because he taps greater powers than they do. He leans on the psychic. He said, I am the subconscious of my race. He unifies them. He kills everybody off that isn't in harmony with him, and he just represents that. And he's working on a plane that Daladi and Chamberlain down on the third dimension can't reach. He does strange things. He gets in tune with the stars, and then he says it's time to march into Czechoslovakia. They all say, his leaders say it's wrong, and it just works. He rolls up Czechoslovakia, rolled up Poland, rolled up France. I mean, he hadn't gone into Poland yet. Yes, rolled up Poland, rolled up France. And I said to Roland, to Len Harding and Starr Daily, can you leave your work and go with me and go to all the leading cities and go out and spread what we call the third front? Russia's begging us to start a second front, and we won't be ready for that for 2 years. But we've been training in love and prayer. We think it's more powerful than bombs. Let's just go out, and we took 7 months in all the larger cities. We had schools of prayer in the afternoon, in the evening mass meetings like this, and then we'd send love to Hitler, whom we were fighting. Why, if McCarthy had been rampant in those days, we'd pulled us right in and doomed us down as third, fifth columnists and everything else. And this way, we started it November 1st, 1942. I announced and wrote it in an article, came out in the Clear Horizons magazine before we started it. I said, the moment we start that love, then all that subconscious stuff he's shooting out against us will boomerang back on him. All our battles before November 1st, 1942 were defeats, and after that they were all victories. Everything Hitler did before that was just like magic. Everything after that just rolled back and boomeranged on him. Instead of crossing the Channel and conquering England when he had a chance, he attacked Moscow and was beaten back. And then he changed the generals, blamed them, and put in worse generals. Down, 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 down. I really have got to I've tried it individually. Now, if you have an enemy, you send love to them, and pretty soon they'll get some bumps, and pretty soon they'll get to love you. It isn't a mean thing in that way. If they hold out and continue to breathe hatred and slaughter, they do get it. Hitler continued to breathe out slaughter and hatred and slaughter, and he went smashing down. But here was Stephen. Why, he was just going to wipe out all the Christians. They were scared. They were getting in a panic. But Stephen wasn't. He stood there. He's being stoned to death. And what did he do? He sent love out to the man that had betrayed him. He said, hold this not against them. He sent out a wall of love. After that, the murder and the slaughter that Saul was sending out struck him on the road to Damascus and banged him down. If he'd have gotten up like Hitler did and kept at it again, he'd have gone down again. The third time he'd have gone down, and they'd have had a grave. They can't even find Hitler's grave now. They wouldn't have found Saul of Tarsus' grave. But when he was knocked down, it changed him. Now I'm really talking here on language that they don't seem to understand. And when I'd say let's get all the Christians to send a wall of love out there, why, I would say that it would only be a matter of 3 months before there'd be a sudden awakening all over China and Russia. We wouldn't have to send an armed man over there. It would just disintegrate. Or the leaders would get reformed and come across and say, we'd like to work out a system of coexistence, and we'll work out our socialistic system, and we'll stop some of our propaganda stuff. I want to say this is just as clear-cut, and it's all there in the Sermon on the Mount. And who believes the Sermon on the Mount? The Christian nations, least of all. Gandhi said everything in that Sermon on the Mount will work, and I'm going to try it out. And so with the Bhagavad Gita in one hand and the Sermon on the Mount in the other, he went around India, and without the firing of a gun, he liberated 1/5 the human race from the greatest empire that has ever existed. And he refused to become a Christian because he says, I can't find a Christian nation, a so-called Christian nation, that is willing to even use the Sermon on the Mount. And they've had to let me use it to prove what can be done, and we're still afraid to use it. That's the relationship man to man. And the relationship to God, what about that? 3 ways to reach God. One is by prayer. But it should be a pure prayer, not to show off. Don't go up on the marketplace and put up a soapbox and let everybody see how pious you are. Then you've received your reward. And there's another way. If you can't reach him, if you're not a mystic and get that inner sense of union with God, get a blood transfusion with him. And what is it you love more than anything, you asked the millionaire? My money. I lost $300,000 in the crash of 1929, and I felt just like I was being bled to death almost, just as like losing my lifeblood. All right, supposing you take 1/10 of that and give it to the Lord. And because you have so much when you get to be a millionaire, you can make him senior partner, give him 51%. You can give 20% free of income tax, so at least give 20%. In other words, he takes up there what they call, he called alms. That's another way of reaching God. It isn't so much a gift to mankind, it's a gift really to God. And then the third way is by relinquishing things. Fasting, or on Lent, giving up something that's precious to you. And that way it brings you closer in contact to God. When I was a boy, they wanted me to give up something, and I said, I'll give up spinach. My little boy said he'd be glad to give up soap during Lent. But to give up something that's precious. Abraham's willing to take his boy up and give him back to the father. And then the Lord stopped him. If you're willing to relinquish it. If you're willing to give all your business, relinquish it. That's more than, that's really relinquishing something. That's what we call fasting. And then he ends that with a marvelous psalm prayer, not on love, but on trust. Again, it isn't 98% or 99%, but 100%. Take no anxious thought what you shall eat and what you shall drink. Just look at the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Well, a Unitarian minister gave an attack on that once. The Unitarians believe that that Jesus was a great leader. Some Unitarians think he's the greatest spiritual leader, but some don't, and they often begin their sermons with a quotation from, they think all men are equally inspired, with a quotation from Ruskin or from Emerson. This particular Unitarian minister is very radical along these lines, and he said that of all absurdity, that advice of Jesus to take no anxious thought. Of course we should take anxious thought. But he didn't notice the parable that was used, and Jesus always told his vital truth. He clinched it with a parable. He said, look at the lilies of the field, and it opens itself up to the source of life, rain and sun. But if you build a roof of selfishness over that lily, or a lean-to of pride, or a wall of hate, it had better take a lot of anxious thought. So if you have a bitterness against folks, or even if you're filled with fear, yes, a shed of fear shuts up. Fear means lack of trust of God. Then you shake anxious thought, but we've got to do a lot of work to remove those. That's what we come here at the campfire. Get rid of our those things that block, our angers, our fears, our resentments, and our egos and so on. And then what's happened? Then you're nothing between you and the source of life. You don't have to take any anxious thought at all. No anxious thought whatever. And it's amazing how safe and secure and everything works out. The right ideas at the right time. If I was filled with anger or with fear and got up here to speak, I wouldn't be sure I was going to say the right things, wouldn't know what to choose. But if I put myself and remove all those things, just put myself out in the hands of God, I could get up here and start off on almost any line that the Lord might, I could feel that's sure that he was sending through me. And so guidance comes as you remove those things. And he ends that with that wonderful psalm prayer. Then he comes to this last third, chapter 7. And I thought he'd just thrown the leftovers that he couldn't organize in those first two chapters. But I've since discovered there's a marvelous putting together. They're almost like a mosaic. He sums up the essential things that he wants you especially to remember about our relationship to man, and the two essential things you must especially remember in relationship to God, especially if you want your prayers answered. I used to love to hear a minister when I was a boy who gave a very intellectual sermon, two-packed the things for you to remember, and then he would rejoice your heart by closing with a comment, now I'm going to sum up what I've been saying in slightly different words. And in a little 2 or 3 minute summary, as beautiful as the Gettysburg Address, not repeating a single thing, nothing monotonous. He would restate those things in different words so you'd always carry them with you. And that's what Jesus did here. He said, now, if you want to pray, just get your relationship with man right and with God right, and then the roof's off, and then you can just pull the trigger, as it were, and there you hit the mark. And he said, I'll rearrange this like you do in a gun. One thing you must not do in relationship to man, one thing you must do. Then back here, one thing you must not do in your relationship to God, one thing you must do. Arrange them right in line. Narrow's the way that leadeth to light, and broad's the way that leads to failure. But you get that little narrow line and get the aim, pull the trigger, and what happens? Your prayer will come to pass. And the test of whether you're right in your relationship to man and God is whether your prayer hits the mark. If it always misses, by your fruits you shall know them. If you're hating somebody, have resentments against this and all that, and then there's something the matter. The thing you must not do in relationship to man is to judge. Judge not if you want your prayers answered. And he used an illustration from his carpenter trade that interested me because my own brother was a carpenter and an architect. I went into a building he was erected, and my friend was with me, looked up above. He could hear someone sawing, and one of his carpenters was there, and one of the little motes got in his eye, and he began to make some terrific grimaces. Another chap coming in the other entrance saw the faces he was making, and he burst into loud guffaws of laughter. Another carpenter coming in from the other wing with a big beam over his shoulder saw everybody looking at this chap with the making faces, and he swung around to take a look, and the beam hit the laughing chap right under the eye. Now, I have found that there's nothing that harms a prayer group, prayer power, as much as this sense of righteous indignation or a sense of moral judgment. I have a right to judge that person. I don't like the way she wears her clothes, or I don't like her. So when you get in a group, get prayer groups in your hometown. If two folks want to join who just mutually hate each other, go and talk with them individually and see if they can overcome that. If they say, no, I just despise her, I just feel just sick all over when I sit there in that prayer group, well, then say, time's come, well, let's divide into two prayer groups, a little smaller. You just can't get anywhere. Jesus knew that. He selected 12 men. Out of all these men, trained folks, 3 million people, trained in the law and the prophets of Israel. He selected 12, and even there he couldn't go so far. Here's jealous Judas and doubting Thomas. So when he wanted to go very far, he picked out Peter and James and John. In your little prayer groups that want to go places, see that there's a mutuality. That doesn't mean you should shut people out. In prayer groups, prayer classes, where you teach them how to pray, then let everybody come. But when you want to, if there's a matter of life and death, and you'll get a group together, and two of them hate each other, not going to get anywhere. We divide into prayer groups, you know, and we do that at Coronas, Minnesota. And it so happened that one of the prayer groups, number 9, happened to draw all the best praying folks of the camp. It was just like an all-American team. It was just too bad. They ought to have been sprinkled around. So I was so happy when I went to that group, and the power in that group was so poor. About one of our prayers did more than to hit the ceiling. The next day, Starr Daily said I was in that number 9, and I was awful disappointed. Next day, Glenn Harding was in it, and he said, it's even worse than you say. Why, it's the weakest prayer group I ever saw. I thought there's something the matter with me, but I said, when it keeps happening, there must be something wrong there. The next day, a woman led it who wasn't especially good in leading prayer groups, but she said, I don't see what you're talking about. It is the most powerful group I've ever been in. Dear Mrs. Ruby Russell, the accompaniments for Alice Craft's Rhythms, an elderly woman close to the 80s who loved to go and sit by the lake and meditate like Quakers do, sometimes stayed away from her prayer group. She said to me at supper, I had a unique experience. I was sitting on the bench by the lake, and a Negro woman came and sat down at the other end. And I said, why aren't you in your prayer group? She said, I've just been becoming aware that there's a woman in my prayer group, I'm in number 9, she said, that takes offense at my presence. And I thought that, I noticed there wasn't much power, and I wondered if that could be holding you back. So I thought if I just stayed away, there wouldn't be any offense, and there'd be more power. And the power is tremendous. Well, that night I stood and told just what I'm telling you. I didn't mention the prayer group number, and nobody knew what I was referring to, but the woman who especially was to blame. She sought out the Negro woman, asked her pardon, begged her forgiveness, and begged her to come back. And they broke down that barrier, and the power in that prayer group after that was tremendous. It's all the difference in the world. You just can't go far. That's not the place for unforgiveness and for jealousy and criticism. Remove that. Then the thing you must do in relationship to man is just summed up in the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. There's others. Don't need to comment on that. Then what is it that you must not do in relationship to God? Don't expose these sacred things to scoffing or slander or blasphemy of others or of yourself. Don't you scoff at these things, or don't even expose it. Supposing we're praying here tonight, we're going to pray about something. For instance, just before we left with the other camp, they said we need rain here, and why not pray for rain? Well, we prayed for rain. We asked the Lord to wait, if possible, till you people had arrived, and then after we go to bed tonight, let the rain come. But I wouldn't be surprised if on the way home, and they probably went home and said, some neighbors, we prayed for rain. Perhaps the neighbors said, we need rain badly. Well, we prayed for rain out there. And the neighbors didn't say anything, but when they go back their home, they'd say, oh yeah, there's some more crackpots. In other words, you spill these things out, and it's just like this delicate blood transfusion. You mustn't expose it to the air. Don't talk about these things. Don't let them get... and he said there's 2 special groups you want to avoid. He called them swine. He's very allegorical. And dogs. The swine are the materialists that'll trample them under their feet, just good, honest chaps working away, but they just don't believe this sort of thing, and they just have to kind of laugh at it. They'll trample it under their feet. Then the other, the dogs, the watchdogs, and those are the very spiritually or ecclesiastically minded folks that are always on guard, lest someone's going to be go off the deep end and be crackpots or shysters and all that. I found that they're more disturbing, and I have addressed nearly all the theological seminaries in America. And I want to congratulate the professors for being on their guard. They don't want anyone to come in and build up an idea of just a lot of hocus pocus and using God as a cosmic bellboy to run your errands and all. And they don't, if they come to a camp farthest out, they know we don't do that. We put ourselves at the feet of the Lord perfectly, but when we get completely in alignment with Him, then we can ask Him like a son asks the Father, and we can ask with faith, and wonderful things do happen. However, I spent a week addressing the women of Harry Emerson's Fosdick's church in 1929. Since Saturday night came, I was to address the full church in congregation or group in Dr. Buttrick's church. I took supper with Dr. Buttrick and some friends, and everything was so cordial and nice. But when I rose to speak in that Dr. Buttrick's church, instead of finding everything going marvelous, they had been warmed up, growing in power as it were all week, I found I was just baffled. I was like throwing a rubber ball against the wall, and it just bounces back. Every thought I was throwing out just was hitting a wall. I couldn't penetrate. Fortunately, I had my talk almost all written out, and I almost had to read it, or I'd have been lost. The next day, I took lunch with Professor and Mrs. Johnson Fleming, Daniel Fleming of Union Theological Seminary, and Miss Bertha Condé. Miss Condé was a great spiritual leader among in those days, great in demand with all the women's groups and the student groups. She said, "You know, I didn't hear a word you said in Dr. Buttrick's church last night. A man came in and sat in front of me that exuded such cynicism and criticism and scoffing that I just spent the hour praying that he'd either get up and leave or that spirit would leave, and I couldn't get anywhere. There it was." The Flemings looked at each other, and then Dr. Fleming said, "I might as well tell you, Glenn, that I saw the man. He's a professor of theology and psychology in Union Seminary. And he was very jealous that you were given the assignment to give that talk instead of him. He sat there, and what was he doing? He was like the watchdog. He was just tearing. Bertha Condé said I was called on to address the students of University of Pennsylvania, and I spoke for a few minutes, and then I stopped. I said, I came here to bring a message of inspiration and illumination and goodwill to you folks, and I thought you were coming in a receptive mood, and I think you all are, but there's one man has come with a purpose to scoff. He's sitting a little to the right of the center aisle. I'm going to ask that we have a period of silent prayer and remains in silent prayer until either he gets up and goes out or that spirit gets up and goes out. And she said we had 7 minutes of silent prayer. If I were going to call on, tell you I was going to have 7 minutes of silent prayer, why it'd drag out, you'd think it was like an hour. And for students, young active students, to sit there patiently, and then something dropped, she said, and I could speak with a tremendous power. Later, a professor came up and said, you certainly had your nerve. There's a professor of psychology at this university that goes to every religious talk, and he carefully takes notes, and then he just tears it to pieces in his psychology class the next day. He'll never do it again. Everyone knew who you're referring to, but you yourself. And there it was. So I'm very frank in saying that I can't tell you what it means to come to a group like this. And I can tell you how I can write in the last 6 years, I've turned out a book a year, every year. And it takes ordinary writers 2 or 3 years if they give full time to it. And I only don't have any time, excepting between 5 and 7 in the morning. So lecturing all the time and busy at home when I am, the few months I'm at home. But I'll tell you, I go over to my Bible class. I've been doing it for the last 26 to 7 years. And what they do. Jesus said to the folks, if they receive you as a righteous man, they'll get a righteous man's reward. A little firstly, secondly, thirdly. That's the way we go to our churches. Yes, he's not a very good preacher, but we'll have to stand it, and you have to stand it. But if they receive you as a prophet, as a channel of God, why then the Lord will speak right through you, and they'll get a prophet's reward. Well, they come from 40 different churches, and they come to this Bible class. I close 15 minutes ahead of time so they can get to their churches. And they say they don't come for eloquence, they come for manna. They listen to me, they're expecting the Lord to speak through me, and the result is I go home. I haven't had time to prepare my talk when I went there, but I'll get out of, this doesn't happen every Sunday, but about every third or fourth Sunday, I'll take out a card, say, my little notebook, and jot down the outline. Well, I didn't know I could give as brilliant a talk as that. That was a really thing fell together perfectly. Then I come to camps, and I give that talk, and I give it, for several years until you get bored, and I get bored, and then I put it in a book, and it's no work at all, that class. They just pull it out. But you know, if 3 Pharisees should come in there sitting by to find fault with me, I just close up like a clam. I don't see how Jesus could talk as eloquently as he did when there's always a bunch of Pharisees sitting by. But when he wanted to go very far and get revelations, just notice he'd draw apart. Or take those disciples aside and then take just 3 of them up on Mount Hermon. To go to the high places, be sure they're all in tune. And he knew what he's talking about. Well, I must bring this to a close. Then those are the things you must not do in relationship to God. You must treat with reverence. And then what you do in relation to God. There is the positive thing. There is where he was very emphatic, the most emphatic thing he ever said. I might say the only thing I can compare with the emphasis that he put on that was the address that Eisenhower gave before the World Council of Churches, in which he called for a stream of prayer, and I'm going to read his statement a few days from now when we want to broadcast love over the world. Never was a statement, a man ever revealed his great faith in prayer as Eisenhower did there. Well, now, if you want to find the greatest condensers in the world, open a Reader's Digest. I know the editors of that. They came from Macalester College. But you look at that list of editors. They're the greatest condensers in the world, artists in it, but they can't hold a candle to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why, they condense the greatest story ever told into 4 narratives, any one of which could be read through in 1 hour. Not a wasted word. And yet notice how Jesus wasted some words here, seemingly. Repeated the thing 10 times. He was so emphatic about it. He said, ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. There's 3 times. Now he's going to give 3 more. For whosoever asketh shall receive, whosoever knocketh shall find, shall be opened, whosoever seeketh shall find. 6 times. Now there's 3 more. For which of you, being a father, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone, and if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion, and if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? It's 9 times. Now he's going to make a 10th. And if you, being evil, can give good gifts to your children when they ask, how much more will that Father of love, giver of good and every good and perfect gift, give you unto you when you ask? Well, then he said in this, he ends this sermon by saying, blessed are ye if you go out and do these things. You're like a man building your house on a rock. And so I said, well, I want to do it. And a letter came from a graduate of our college of 20 years before, and she said, Dear Prof, Gwen, who you and Mrs. Clark loved so dearly, that's a lovely, she's a classmate of mine, has had an awful hard life after these 20 years of graduation, but now at last she has her 4 children around her. She has a happy job of teaching in Rapid City, South Dakota, where I live. And everything just is running so smoothly, and now the doctor says she has cancer of the kidney. She must be operated on, and he's quietly told one of the nurses that they're just to shoot her with morphine, dope, until she dies, because there's no hope, and he's not going to even bother to come up and take a second look. I don't think it's fair for if it's a good God to treat a beautiful girl, a lovely girl like Gwen that way. And I don't pray. I don't have much faith in prayer, but you're a man of prayer, Prof. Won't you pray for her? Well, I said, now let's see if I can get my lines right and get the aim right. And we're just going to try this law of Jesus. First place, do I judge anybody? No, I am free of judgment. Am I willing to do unto others as they do unto you? Yes. Well, I be careful not to tell this to anyone who will scoff at it, and I mustn't scoff at it. I certainly won't. My wife wouldn't, but the way my wife is so afraid of that particular disease, she doesn't have hardly any faith that prayer can do it. I hardly don't have much faith myself at that time, and maybe I better not tell her. That would weaken her a little. I won't tell anyone. There remains one thing then, is to have the faith in a loving Father. So I went up to my bedroom. I didn't usually go to all the elaborateness of this kind. I'd shut the door and went in and knelt down by the bed, and I said, Dear Father. Now, when Jesus used the term Father, he was going way beyond that Old Testament word of Jehovah and the mighty judge and all that. I call my Father, Father. My son calls me Dad. Still more. I'm not sure, but if Jesus were walking the earth today, he might talk of his Father as his beloved Dad. At any rate, that's such a lovely term. As my boy uses it, I want to confess that I use that a little. I said, Dear Dad. Then I did feel that wasn't quite respectful, so I said, Dear Father. But I said, now I have two lovely daughters, and if one of them had a hard life and at last come into happiness and all, I wouldn't pull her out of it because I love her so much. Now this Gwen isn't a daughter of mine, she's a daughter of yours. If anything happened to her, it wouldn't be my hard luck, it would be your hard luck. I know that your love for your daughters is far greater than my love. And your power is greater. You could save your daughter. I couldn't save mine unless you did it through me or for me. But you have a wisdom that I don't have, and maybe in your greater wisdom it may be better for her to go to heaven. I can't decide those things. But I want to say this, Father, if you'll just let me talk just like a son right close to you. I want to say frankly, Father, I can't see where it would be better for her. It would be in heaven. Yes, heaven would be wonderful for her, but for her children and all, I don't think that she'd really want it. But I'm going to trust your wisdom, Father. I'm going to trust your power, and I'm going to trust your almighty love. I'm going to put her utterly in your hands. I had my sights right. I pulled the triggers that were. I didn't feel I had anything to block it. So I just left it with him and went downstairs, let the week go by, 10 days went by, and then a letter came. After 3 days, the doctor said, if she's making such a fight for life, I'm going to take a look. And he came in and he said, by Jove, she's going to get well. That operation was a perfect success. The other kidney's making perfect compensation. Well, 6 months later, another letter came saying, Gwen is healthier than she's been for years and perfectly happy. But the biggest miracle that happened in Rapid City, South Dakota, wasn't what happened to Gwen. It's what happened to the doctor. He takes God into the operating room now every time. I was giving this talk in Miami before the largest church in the South, 2,000 people filling the church. There's a radio. That afternoon, a woman called up. She said, I'm a bed case. I tune in to the Sundays to Dr. Stockman. But this morning, I was trying to shift my radio. I couldn't get it past a certain wavelength, and then a voice said, now you'll hear Dr. Glenn Clark of St. Paul, author of The Soul's Sincere Desire, speak on the Sermon on the Mount. Why, here's The Soul's Sincere Desire by my table. I had been leaning on it for years. I never thought I'd hear you, so I said, well, I'll hear him. And when you told about that healing of that cancer condition, the reason I'm a bed case, I have one of my kidneys is gone and the other is in constant hemorrhage. And that hemorrhage stopped while you were speaking. And the doctor's come this afternoon and he says maybe it's permanent. And he'll look at me over tomorrow, and if it's all right, I can come over to Coral Gables and hear you speak Monday afternoon. She came. Tuesday afternoon, not only did she come for the afternoon, but she took the potluck supper and heard me in the evening. Years have gone by. She's been to the Camps Farthest Out, and the last I heard of her, she was chairman of the spiritual life groups of Miami. Just hearing over the phone, there's something about the Sermon on the Mount. I won't say it's magic. All I'm saying is it's the soundest, surest, right, feet on the ground way of conducting your life in relationship to man, relationship to God, and the simplest little technique of prayer you can find. It's just like something you can carry in your hip pocket, pull it out anytime, use it. And I have great respect that Gandhi took that and he read it, and he read it. He was traveling through India. Sometimes he'd be tired. He said, come crowds out to hear him speak. He said, I'm going to give you a better sermon than I can preach, and he would read that. Of course, it was in modern Indian. It was a little more modernized in their language. They really got it. They had never heard it before, and they said, well, that's a wonderful message. Well, here we are. Supposing we just take that little Sermon on the Mount then, resolve to apply it in our relationship to man while we're here, in relationship to God, and definitely try, even tonight if you want to see that that you've got your sights just right. Aim on something you'd like to pray for, and just send the shaft of love out there toward that need, and just see what may happen. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this great charter, Magna Carta, that we can use for our life. We can take it right here at the beginning of this Camp Farthest Out and make it a living pattern to guide our life now and forever. We want to thank You, Jesus, for that marvelously assembling ideas. Not only did You give Your life,